First and foremost, I would like to say hello and thank you very much for showing an interest in how editing stations help reduce cognitive overload. Now, I've seen the impact that editing stations have in my own school, and I felt it important to share. However, when I saw the overwhelming response that I got, well, I was overwhelmed. So again, thank you. Now, we are limited to a 40-minute session here on Zoom. So what I am going to speak to you about today is very much an overview of cognitive overload, the working memory, and how editing stations can help support both. As I said, if you have any questions throughout, then do feel free to put them into the chat. I'm aiming for this session to go on for about 30 minutes, giving us 10 minutes at the end, again, to ask any further questions. If you'd like to speak to me individually afterwards or anything else comes to mind, then do feel free to contact me either at our Twitter, grammarworks_, at the email grammarworks0@gmail.com, and I'm also going to be sharing the link to a feedback form right at the end, which does have the option, again, to contact me of any further queries. So let's get started. Who am I? Well, I'm a Key Stage 2 teacher first and foremost. My NQT year, I was in year 5. I was then in year 6 for 4 years after that. And this year I've had a little bit of a change and I've gone down to year 4. I'm a year group leader and I have been for the last 3 years. I'm also the English coordinator in our school and have been for 4 years. This year I am training to be a lead practitioner. So I'm undergoing my accreditation at the moment with the SSAT. I'm also one half of GrammarWorks. GrammarWorks is a new grammar scheme that we're setting up. It is a progressive scheme looking at the teaching of grammar all the way through Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2, making sure that learning is built on from year to year. What I am not is a scientist. So everything I'm talking about here, I've read about, I've researched, and I've put into practice. None of this I have personally made up myself. So let's get started. What is cognitive overload? So cognitive overload is when we give children too much to think about at one given time. What this does is it results in the learner, the child, being able to process all the information that we give them. I'm going to take a moment and think about a lesson on adverbs. Imagine you're introducing adverbs for the very first time. Are you going to teach them about adverbs of manner, frequency, time, and place, all in that one session? I'm hoping there's some shaking of the heads here. Why not? Well, it's quite a simple answer, isn't it? It's too much. The children will probably come away knowing that an adverb describes a verb. They probably will have learnt that all adverbs are not ly words. But actually, will they have a depth of understanding? How will they have retained that information? It's very unlikely. So instead, when we teach adverbs, we chunk them. We teach about adverbs of manner first, generally. We teach about frequency, time, place, in any order that you see fit. But we wouldn't teach them all in one go. Same as determiners. You wouldn't teach the 4 determiners in the first lesson on determiners. So why are we asking children to do so much in one lesson on editing? Let's have a little look at cognitive overload then. Now, the idea of cognitive overload goes back centuries. It's something that is observable. But it wasn't until the 1980s that John Sweller actually applied it to some research. Now, what Sweller was aiming to do was finding, well, it says it in bold here, what's the best strategy to make a lesson stick. He was looking at a variety of different conditions and testing actually what helped get that learning into the long-term memory. In 1988, he published his research, and I would suggest, if you haven't already, that you do go and take a little look at that at some point. But if we were to summarise his findings in a nutshell, we could go to 3 main bullet points. The first one suggests that our working memory can only hold a limited amount of information, roughly 4 chunks at any one time. So you and I could only hold 4 chunks of information. He also suggests, and this is not new, that if we activate the existing schemas, the connections they can make to their experiences, and then also activate their prior knowledge, we're going to support their memory retention. Now, as I said, I don't think this is new. I think you and I do this all the time. We start lessons with recaps, particularly maths, recapping the past maths lesson, history, recapping what we've just learnt about so we can help the children understand it in a chronological order. In our school, we recap recently taught grammatical skills through a grammar talk at the start of each English lesson. Now, all of these support the children's memory retention. I think it's all something that we do without thinking about why we do it necessarily. Also, he comes up with something called dual coding. Again, something which we do, giving information both verbally and visually. I'm doing it here. I could have just sat here and spoke to you about cognitive overload and not giving you any visuals. But then that is going to overburden one part of your working memory. So instead, you have visuals to look at as well. Now, two parts of my working memory are working simultaneously and supporting each other. Now, I mentioned the word working memory a few times, so it's important that we touch on this while we're here. It's very hard to understand the idea of cognitive overload if we don't understand working memory. So your working memory is essentially the brain activity that's needed to complete a task. Now, Miller in 1956 concluded that an adult can hold 5 to 7 pieces of information at one time, which isn't that much if you really think about it. In 2001, a much more recent study, Cohen et al. Compared different groups of children at different ages. Now, he discovered that 7-year-old central memory is usually limited to only 3 or 5 items. So when we get them to edit, and we're asking them to edit lots and lots of things, are we overloading their working memory? Maybe. Now, there are 4 systems in our working memory. Scientists used to believe there were only 3, but Baddeley in the year 2000 came up with a 4th. Our overarching system is the central executive. This essentially is your boss of the brain. So it drives the whole system, it communicates with the other parts, it also deals with the cognitive tasks. Down here you can see we have the visual spatial sketchpad. As the name suggests, this is where you hold images, process information that's been given to you in a pictorial form. It's often used to guide. Over here we have the phonological loop. Now this deals with the spoken and the written word. It's divided into 2 parts. The first part helps you hold on to speech. Interestingly, this part of the brain can only hold on to 1 to 2 seconds of speech at a time. So although you probably can remember what I said at the start of this slide, can you remember what I said 2 slides ago? Perfectly, word for word. And it's quite tricky, isn't it? So the second part allows us to repeat and process that information, and that bit's really, really important. So when we're asking children to retrieve information, we're doing some quickfire questions, we're getting them to choral read a sentence stem that we've just done. It's the phonological loop that's really, really working there. Baddeley then introduced the episodic buffer, which is almost the backup. You know, when there's new information and I'm a little bit stuck and I can't get to the answer, then my episodic buffer will communicate with the long-term memory. It does what Sweller suggests we support the children in doing. It activates those schemas and that prior knowledge, which I've already attained. So how does it lend itself to editing? You know, the whole point of this session is looking at, well, actually, how the editing stations stop this cognitive overload. So I'm going to give you 15 seconds, and I want you to think about, what does the working memory need to think about when editing? What is it that we're actually asking children to look at and look for when they're editing? I'll stop talking now because I don't want you to split your attention between me and thinking about what they edit. 15 seconds, off we go. 5 seconds remaining. Okay, so that was 15 seconds. Before we move on, to me to show you my list, and you can compare what you had to mine, be interesting just to take a moment to think. When you hit 5 to 7 things that the children had to edit, did you slow down? Did you have to pause for 4? Because our working memory should only be able to hold 5 to 7 things. Now, if I brought those to the forefront of my mind, then it's at this point that my recalling slows down. I mean, I know for sure I found this when I made my list. So let's have a little look and see if we got anything similar. What am I expecting children to edit? Well, I'm expecting them to look at punctuation, so full stops, question marks, exclamation marks, commas. Then I'm thinking about my children working at greater depth, and I might be expecting to see hyphens and dashes and semicolons. I'm expecting to see all of my capital letters correct for proper nouns and the starts of sentences. I'm expecting to see their spellings have been edited and corrected. I'm expecting to see a variety of sentence openers, their tenses consistent throughout, their language choice appropriate. Now, on top of this list, I'm also expecting to see that they have edited neatly, that they have used the note making and the annotations that we use in our school. Okay, there's lots and lots of things here that I'm expecting them to do. I think the list could be endless, and it wouldn't surprise me if you all came up with something different. So let's have a little look then. Editing stations. Now, there are 3 effects which Sveller came up with that I think editing stations address. So the first one is the split attention effect. Now, this is when you give children too many things to focus on, too many different places that their attention could go. Instead of that, well, we don't split their attention. We give them one thing that they need to focus on. So I'm not focusing on spellings and full stops and sentence openers and capital letters. I'm going to focus on a key area at a time. We have the redundancy effect to get rid of anything that doesn't need to be there. Don't give them more than what they need to do. Keep it simple. And I imagine that the outcomes will be a lot more productive. You then have the modality effect, giving them more than one mode of communication. Now, I think as teachers, we're very, very aware of this. We're aware of giving children oral instruction, but also having visuals on the board. It's something we naturally do. I could have run this session by just talking to you, but then I would be overbearing your phonological loop. So instead, I've made slides to go with it. So actually, 2 parts of your working memory are now working in tandem together, helping to unburden your cognitive overload. Now, editing stations aren't new, and I want to put this out there right now. I didn't make them up. In fact, it was about 4 years ago that I saw someone tweet about editing stations. So I thought, yeah, editing is not great in my class. Let me give this a go. So quick Google, you'll come across many, many templates. But what we're discussing here is, over that 4 years, what I've come to notice, how I've adapted them, how I've changed them, and the positive impact that it has on reducing the children's cognitive overload. And I think a primary cause of that is the chunking technique. Now, we've taken this exhaustive list of things that the children need to edit, and we've grouped them together. Now, through grouping, we actually increase the amount of working memory that a child can take on. Daniel Bohr, in his book, The Ravenous Brain, actually refers to chunking as our ability to hack the limits of our memory, and that's essentially what we're trying to do here. We're trying to find ways in which we can improve our memory and improve the children's memory as well. Very small example would come from Darren Brown's autobiography, where he talks about how he manages to retain such large amounts of information, and he does it through chunking. He does it through grouping. So let's have a little look at how we chunked the editing stations. Now, when I looked at editing stations online 4 years ago, and got some ideas, I came up with 4 different stations, 4 different groups, as you may say. The first one focuses on punctuation, it's called punctuation points. The second one focuses on vocabulary, the third on spellings, and the fourth on grammar. Now, what I have done is I have taken the exhaustive list of things they must edit and put them under each. So, for example, you find your exclamation marks, your question marks, your full stops here when you're looking at your punctuation. But at that point, you're not looking at your spellings because we're not going to overload our working memory. Now, when you come to introduce this to your school, to your class, to teachers, I would suggest that you begin with a whole class approach, because it does take a little bit of training, but it's worth it in the long run. You might start just with 2 stations, the 2 that you think actually your class need to focus on the most. You would introduce the station. You don't have to call it a station if you don't want to, but introduce now that chunking area and model it. Model it. So put up an example of a piece that isn't punctuated very well, it's got some tense mistakes, a few spellings, some vocabulary that could be adapted, maybe a repetition of a proper noun all the way through, and model. So here I am, I'm at punctuation point. I'm going to model how I use the resource, which I'll show you in a second, to go through and edit. Start small. Start with the children thoroughly editing 1 paragraph. As they become more confident with their editing and more familiar with the resources, you'll find they edit more and more and more. Now, pre-COVID, when I was in year 6, my class became very familiar with this, to the point that actually I ran it as a carousel. So I'd start the lesson by reminding them of the expectations at each station, and they would rotate around the room. Now, the children would physically move, not the station. And I found this really effective because they would go from a table where they've independently looked at punctuation to a table that's covered in dictionaries. This table's covered in dictionaries, so I have to focus on my spellings here because I'm about to move on in 10 minutes and there's not going to be dictionaries there again. It really hones in that one area that you want them to look at. The other thing I love about doing it as a carousel, and I can't wait for post-COVID to do it again, is I sit on Grammar Garden. So I don't take a focus group during this lesson. I'll sit at one station, Grammar Garden, I don't move, and all the children move around me. This means that every single child in my class, and I do have a class of 30, come through Grammar Garden. I can read with every single one of them in that 10 minutes, a paragraph or a few sentences. I can give some really purposeful feedback on the spot. And I think that's actually one of the strongest ways to do this. So let me show you the resources that we have prepared and that I'm going to share with you at the end of this session. Now, as you said, we have 4 stations. I have used the underground sign because we are a school based in London. Doesn't mean you have to. These are totally editable on Word. You could use your school logo. Trying to do something they're familiar with so their attention doesn't fall on a new picture, but actually on the learning itself. So what we give the children are these visual prompts, which essentially work as a checklist. So you'll see that on punctuation point, it takes them through, this was built for year 6, the working towards the expected and the greater depth standard. And I'll show you in a minute how I would expect a child to go through each of those. Spelling square, we really encourage the children to share their learning with somebody else, to actually ask their partner, can you spot any spelling mistakes here? Because they've spelt words how they think words are spelt. They're going to struggle to find the mistakes. Vocab Valley, this takes a bit of training, this one, but it's more about revision here. It's about adding in adjectives to make an expanded noun phrase. It's spotting when you use that proper noun too much and replacing it with pronouns or replacing it with reference chains. So looking at those sentence starters, they'll go the. You know, what is it that they can change? And then when they have finished that list, then they might look at thesauruses. The last one, Grammar Garden, if you haven't noticed already, is one of my favourites. Here they get their work read aloud to them, either by an adult or by their partner. Again, takes a bit of training because we want the children to read it word for word. If there's a missing word, don't put that word in as you read. Okay, if there's missing punctuation, don't add in expression. because there's no exclamation mark. Here you're really getting the children to listen for tense, listen for missing words, listen to whether actually it makes sense. So let's imagine that this child who's written this paragraph here is on punctuation point. What I would expect them to do is use this like a checklist. Does every sentence end in punctuation? Newbie could hear every single slave's chief chattering, the clink and the rattle of chains, while the mist is swallowing everyone. Comma, capital T. Okay, so I think he probably means that this is the end of a sentence here. Potentially it's the end of a sentence here, and this is acting as a fronted adverbial. So I'd expect him to find his mistake and edit it. He can then tick that off because he's finished that one. Move on to the second one. Can you see question marks at the end of every question? Now, there are no questions here. I would probably expect him to tick that off. A higher attaining child, I probably expect them to question why there's no questions. To go, I haven't got any questions in this, so could I add them somewhere? And again, touching on that revising. Are there any exclamations? Well, there's not, so you can give that a tick. Again, this is a narrative written on an extract from the book Thieves of Ostia, which I'd highly recommend for anyone who is looking at Romans. And it's all about the slaves being pulled through the market town of Ostia. So there probably are places where exclamations could go. Did you use apostrophes for possession and contraction? Every time I'm expecting them to come back and read again. You could hear every single slave's teeth chattering, slave's teeth. I would hope he'd spot the noun teeth and understand it belongs to the slave. Possession, I've got possession there. We've already done possession in grammar, so I understand that possession is a belonging. Okay, so you can probably find that an apostrophe needs to go here. What he probably doesn't understand is that there's more than one slave. So we're looking at an apostrophe for plural possession. But that's something as a teacher I need to pick up on. When I'm walking around, when I'm talking to them, I'd pick up on that and take those few minutes to sit with that child and explain what I mean by singular and plural possession, and so forth. So he'd make his way through this list until time's up. Now, I do put a timer on them because otherwise it can go on for ages and you'll get children starting to change things that don't need changing. So I tend to do 10 minutes for each one, which is why I said start small, start with one paragraph. Now, it's still quite a lot of information for your lower attainers, for your children who are not working at your year group, for the children who are EAL or SEM. So within our school, we've created this train map, which they use. Obviously, the train can be any mode of transport that you so wish, but they take this editing journey. Now, this map is much more specific to the piece of writing that they're doing. So, for example, is your story in past tense? Now, for the other sheet, we just said check your tense. Okay, we would probably remind them in the modelling and the input what tense it was, but for these children, it's explicit on their sheet. Take a look at your verbs, do they end in ed? Check capital letters. Does Emma and Piero have capital letters? Now, Emma and Piero were characters in the narrative that this children was writing. So they would take Emma, they would look for Emma, they would look for Piero. Lots of this comes from your AFL as you mark the writing before they edit. When you're walking around, when you're working with the children, when you look at it at the end of the day, actually what is it that you really want these children to hone in on? Now, this journey can be as long or as short as you want. There could just be capital letters and grammar. There could just be full stops and punctuation. There could be fine free spellings and spellings. And there could be use a thesaurus to change 2 words. Or you can make it as long as you want. And this is the nice thing, it's adaptable to all the children in your class. But I would say with this, just make sure it's specific at certain points. So, for example, vocabulary, you can see there's nothing here about an expanded noun phrase. But what I do want them to think, because you've practiced it in the teaching sequence, is actually use the word Emma a lot. Could you call her something else? I would hope at this point they would know about their pronouns, so she or her, and perhaps they'd start by using reference chains like the Jolly Cook, for example. Now, I just wanted to come towards the end by showing you some examples of editing within our school. This one here to the left is a Year 5 child who you can see the teacher has scaffolded their editing. So prior to the editing session, the teacher has gone through and put some annotations in the margin to support them. Now, this is a child who didn't require the scaffolding sheet, who was using the 4 stations, but does still require that little bit of extra help. So actually we guided them to where they needed to edit. It's just that redundancy effect, just getting rid of something that they didn't have to do. They didn't have to find the mistake. We showed them where the mistake was, they just had to correct it. Now the second child here, you can see there's been a couple of things that's been indicated by the teacher, but not everything. So this is key features this time. This is things that actually we think they're going to find this a little bit tricky to find. But you can see the teacher still expected them to be able to find missing words and put it in, which they did successfully. Correct capital letters, which they have done successfully. Add an inverted comma, which they have done successfully. You then have this child over on to the right here. You have 4 child who the teacher has decided not to support them with the editing prior to writing. And this is a child in my class and she's one of my higher attainers. So actually I wanted to see what she could do. And I could see that she recognised her formality. She changed its to it is. She has corrected some spellings. She has added in some parenthesis. She's added in a relative clause. She's added in a whole sentence down here. So actually for her, she's using a lot of that vocabulary and a lot of that revising to improve her writing. I had a quick talk with a few children in the school, and this is what they had to say. So in Year 3 said, I enjoy Spelling Square because I've just learned how to use a dictionary. Year 3 have just been doing a lot of work on dictionary use. Year 4, I really like editing because I know exactly what I'm looking for. They've been doing this for a year now. So actually they're very familiar. Year 5, my editing has really improved over the last couple of years. I'm feeling a lot more confident to do it independently. So upstairs in Upper Key Stage 2, we're starting to see more independence. Year 6, now we do a lot of work with our children around metacognition, how the brain works. So they're all very familiar with the terms working memory and cognitive overload. So this child said, I free my working memory. I find editing enjoyable. It doesn't feel hard work because I'm guided through it. I also just wanted to give a little bit of teacher voice. So this is something that I have introduced to a teacher at one of our partner schools who very kindly said that they've started to use the editing stations in several year groups. It's fantastic, and I just wanted to say thank you. They're hoping to develop it further in their school. She also said you sharing it has had a great impact here. So thank you. And that's the whole point of this session, isn't it? I'm hoping that actually this has an impact further than just within my own school. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of quotes from some key educators who you have probably heard of. So we've got, learning is the long-term retention of knowledge and skills and the ability to transfer between them. We've got Schweller, who says, if nothing has changed in long-term memory, then nothing has been learned. And Dan William that says, memory is as thinking does. Whatever students think about is what they remember. So bear in mind that redundancy effect. Give them what they need to learn and nothing more. Got a couple of recommended reads here, which I have used online to help me as well in my teaching and in my practice. At the end of both of these, there are more recommended reads should you be looking for more books. As I said at the start, if you wish to contact me any further, I am more than happy to discuss this for longer. This really was just a quick overview. Then you can either contact our Twitter at grammarworks_, email address grammarworks0@gmail.com, or at the end of the feedback form, which I am going to send a link to in the chat right now. There is a box in which you can contact me and leave some details. On that note, I would really appreciate any feedback. This is my first time talking to this many people, and it is something that I will be using towards my lead practitioner accreditation. Kept it short and sweet because I'm very aware that as teachers, time is precious and you have already given up half an hour. I'm going